Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're kicking off, as Emily noted, our spring virtual access series. We'll bring you 3 events over the course of the next few months, and real grateful to have some of my colleagues from cities along the West Coast here with us today to share their perspective from their urban centers and downtowns on lessons and challenges and opportunities they see. And I think all believe that it's so critical for our urban centers, our cities, to renew and rebuild so that innovation and sustainability and our culture and social cohesion within our community and country can be strong. A strong region, a strong city, a strong country requires strong downtowns, and it's really in that spirit and that vein that we gather today with some thought leaders and practitioners from LA, San Francisco, and Portland. Cities that we often compete with, but also seek opportunities to collaborate with and to learn from some of the opportunities and challenges they're facing as they face renewal and recovery from the global pandemic. And we are real grateful to have back our moderator, the host and producer and historian with Cairo Radio, and all around great guy and Seattleite, Felix Spinell, who will moderate our series and today's panel, and we'll introduce our panelists. Thanks so much, Felix, for your continued partnership. I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, John. Yeah, it's my pleasure to do this. I love this intersection of past, present, and future that we get to in these programs. Now, we have some questions we prepared in advance, and we'll get to those. But we'll also get to audience questions at the last portion of the program. But as Emily mentioned, I do want to emphasize, please use the chat function and type in a question anytime you want, because we keep an eye on those and we weave them into the conversation. Before we begin the conversation, we always start with a few data points from downtown Seattle. We just have 3 for us this morning. Now, around returning to the office, along with some recent announcements from Microsoft, Expedia, and the city of Seattle, office percentage has been hovering between 25 and 30%, with the occasional jump to the mid-high 30s. The most recent number is 37% for last week. Now, around tourism and hotel traffic, this is the shoulder season, of course. Hotel occupancy has lately been in the mid 40% range compared to this time of year in the good old days of 2019. Now, on the downtown retail front, there's been some notable good news, such as the new PCC grocery that opened at Rainier Square Tower, which I visited earlier this week. The backdrop's a little more sobering. Of course, since January 2020, about 500 street-level businesses in downtown Seattle have permanently closed. But on the flip side, during that same period, we've had more than 270 new street-level businesses opening in downtown. Regardless, it's an understatement to say it's critical to get more people, whether that's residents, workers, or visitors, returning to downtown. Now, I want to thank everybody and introduce our panelists. Andrew Hoan is president and CEO of the Portland Business Alliance, and he has been since 2018. The Alliance is Greater Portland's Chamber of Commerce, advocating at all levels of government for commerce, community, health, and the region's prosperity. Andrew was previously president and CEO of the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce in New York. Suzanne Holley is president and CEO of the Downtown Center Business Improvement District in Los Angeles, which she first joined in 2013, and she was appointed to lead the organization in 2018. The Downtown Center BID is a coalition of property owners in the 65-block Central Business District of downtown LA, and Suzanne previously spent about 20 years in commercial property management. Marisa Rodriguez is executive director of the Union Square Alliance in San Francisco, and that's a role she assumed in mid-October. The Union Square BID manages and activates public spaces, attracts new investment, and advocates for the district's success. Previously, Marisa directed the Office of Cannabis for the City and County of San Francisco, and was an assistant district attorney for the city. Just a couple things before we get started with the questions. So for a lot of reasons, this was never a neat and tidy pandemic. Not that any pandemic could ever be neat and tidy. And it sometimes seems like we're sorting through so much information and opinion from the conflicting messages and actions from different jurisdictions. And that's why I'm especially pleased. It's priceless to have downtown business leadership from 3 great cities that have a lot in common with Seattle, in the positive column, of course, and also in the challenging column too. So we'll talk this morning about how people are responding to impacts of the pandemic, about the return of workers and residents and visitors, and things around elections and elected officials, and working with the nonprofit community as well. I think geographically, let's work our way south. I want to start with Andrew Hoan from Portland and start with kind of a temperature check. Kind of give me a status report for issues and challenges that are lingering from the pandemic here in, circa February 2022 in the Rose City.
Thanks so much. And hello, everybody from a virtual standpoint. It's actually so refreshing to be able to participate across the West Coast. And I think in some ways, this is the good part of the pandemic, is that we have these conversations and the technology and the familiarity with these tools to be able to actually engage in the commonalities that bind us all together. And I'll share that, of course, we are the Regional Chamber of Commerce, but we also operate the Enhanced Service District of Downtown Portland Clean and Safe, which is the downtown 213 blocks Enhanced Service District. And arose by any other name, still smells as sweet. It's a business improvement district, just like my colleagues here. And so I'm thrilled to be able to be speaking from that perspective of both the Regional Chamber of Commerce as well as the Enhanced Service District. And so the temperature check in Portland and in the Rose City, you're asking the question almost perfectly timed. We released our regional State of the Economy report yesterday. It's an annual exercise that we participate in. I'm going to share some of the findings, particularly to downtown. We often benchmark ourselves against Seattle because, hey, we like to compete, but also share similarities. And the news from the downtown and our region is challenged, and that we are facing a lot of headwinds in recovery, many of them caused by the pandemic, but also what I would overall call, in some cases, self-inflicted problems. And so we see overall both our foot traffic, our visitors, our commercial occupancies are all well below the cities that we typically benchmark ourselves outside of the West Coast. And those present really concerning signs to our downtown core. So if you're asking for the quick 30,000 foot up, it is an unknown and uncertain future that we're facing right now that requires absolute, crystal clear, urgent action around really two primary issues around the unsheltered crisis that we face and a uptick in serious crime and property damage around our center city. So we actually have hit a clarity point in the Rose City, and it's an exciting and possibly huge inflection point for our region.
So with that clarity, I mean, what's happening, and how'd you reach that clarity point, and what's happening because of it?
Well, we do both voter sentiment polling, and so we ask voters in the community how they feel, and we have never seen alignment around the issues and the actions that are necessary to take. So right now, overall, voters in this region believe that only 8% of our voters believe that our region's on the right track. That is a historic and unparalleled low for the sentiments of which direction we're heading in. And for decades, Portland and this region and state have been adding population. We've been adding jobs. The economy is growing. Those assumptions are no longer the case. We have seen overall a decline in both net in-migration as well as natural population growth, which is concerning. We are seeing a lot of individuals moving north of our border, which is the Columbia River, into Vancouver and Clark County in Washington. And we sit on the crossroads of two states which could not have more diametrically opposed taxation structures. So while we have the highest state and local income taxes in the nation, Clark County does not. So we're seeing individuals and households making choices and voting with their feet and moving in different directions and depriving us of the sort of natural organic growth that our region and our downtown core has so desperately depended on for so long. And so we are at a pivot point, and those data elements from voters as well as from the economic elements of our report point to a mindset change that needs to happen here locally.
Okay, we'll come back to you about that mindset change. Let's go south to San Francisco. And what's going on in San Francisco, Marisa?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's interesting listening to Andrew. I have to say, it sounded as if he was speaking exactly about San Francisco. And when I think about this place that we're in, this moment in time, looking out my window and looking at the heart of the city, Union Square, the heartbeat, and not seeing the foot traffic that we once saw, and not seeing the visitors that we once saw. And certainly this time of year, as you noted, isn't a big travel time, but we usually see more people. And what is it? What's happening here? And I think, of course, it's a number of things. Being in a downtown, being in an area that's not historically a residential community. There isn't neighborhood here. And I think all of us follow the rules, and we were very good here, and certainly California, I think most of the West Coast, about being mindful of COVID and sheltering in place and doing all the things we were supposed to do, and really frequenting our corridors, our neighborhood corridors, and really supporting those businesses, but forgetting that downtown existed, really forgetting that the heart of the city here, and our theater district and our restaurant district, and our retail district existed. And without foot traffic and without people, we suffer. But similarly to what Andrew was saying, we are seeing an uptick in crime. We are seeing an uptick in the unsheltered, and challenges in mental health, and things that are really difficult to solve with the tools that we have. And I think we're realizing that we need a different approach, and maybe different tools or expanded tools. And San Franciscans are at a crossroads as well. And we recently had an election just Tuesday, and it really showed us that a lot of, I think, our swing voters are feeling like what we've been doing is not working, and they want to change. And I think that's sounding the alarms for a lot of people, because historically, as San Franciscans, we hold a lot of pride in our ideals, in what we value as a community. And we're having more conversations about, why can't we have both? Why can't we have safety and clean streets and enjoy this beautiful city by the bay, but also still hold on to our desire to reform and our desire to make the world a better place for everyone? So there are a lot of challenges. There's a lot of conversation around that. But yeah, definitely an inflection point, as Andrew noted. We are there.
And that issue of character and identity, I find that particularly fascinating. I mean, it's hard to quantify or objectively say, this is our identity, this is our character. But those things like values and choices around stuff like law enforcement, or how the unsheltered are treated, we're going to dig into that a little bit further in the conversation.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think that's sort of the subtext or the sub conversation beneath all the stuff that we've been facing prior to the pandemic, of course, but in a more intense fashion, certainly in the last 2 years in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and what's going on in Los Angeles, Suzanne?
Sure. So just to give some context about the Downtown Center Business Improvement District, there are 41 bids in the city of Los Angeles. And we have, for a long time, been the largest of these bids. We're in the Central Business District. So the things that we are known for are providing the leading source of information for the downtown market. We also have the largest homeless outreach program of any bid. So we really have a pulse on the spectrum of what's going on in downtown Los Angeles. So I'm going to talk first about the market. We'll do the good news first. Our residential market has surpassed pre-COVID occupancy level, and rental rates were at 94% occupancy in our residential market downtown. And we have 80,000 folks living downtown. And this was kind of one of the really interesting things that we learned through COVID is how powerful those residents were. We had a daytime population of 500,000 before the pandemic. Almost all of the 420,000 office workers went away, but those 80,000 residents sustained us through the pandemic. So they are a passionate and supportive group. We also do surveys as well. And we did surveys throughout the pandemic, and we surveyed our residents and recently, and there's a survey that's just about to come out, and we asked them, they said during this time, about 54% of them thought about leaving. But when we asked them how many actually plan to leave, over 91% said they plan to stay at least a year or more, with 25% saying they plan to stay for 10 years or longer. On the office side, we're still at 15% occupancy. We have very restrictive masking mandates in place. I think that impact that. But when we polled our office workers, they said 93% said that they will be returning to work in some capacity, whether it's one or more days a week. And 80% indicated that the return to work plans will be implemented by the end of June. Retail market, similar to Seattle, we had closures, sure, but we did have 77 retailers that opened since the beginning of the pandemic. And hospitality, our RevPAR numbers have steadily increased. Kind of the bottom was December 2020, and they are working their way back. So a lot of good news there. One thing that we have seen, like everyone else, there's an increase in encampments. During the pandemic, our congregate shelter capacity was reduced. So we saw more folks on the street, and then our city council waived an ordinance requiring that tents be taken down during the day because of COVID. And so with the expanded encampments, we saw expanded crime. A recent survey in December of 2021, 4 in 10 people said that homeless people in their neighborhood make them feel unsafe, and 1 in 5 considered leaving the region as a result. And so we are having our mayor's race this year. It's a hotly contested race. I want to get a bowl of popcorn to watch this. We have a billionaire. We have a congresswoman who is a potential running mate for Biden. Our city attorney and 2 currently serving council members are duking it out, but really all on very similar platforms that address homelessness and public safety.
And in terms of the political solutions, I want to get back to Andrew in Portland. I know we've talked here before in previous programs about the silver lining part of the pandemic. And for me, that was sort of a certain pragmatic spirit that pervaded some of the early months, or maybe the first even year or so, of just, here's a problem, let's address it, whether that's a city, county, or the state. There was at least here in Seattle, we had this sort of sense of like, okay, let's get rid of the usual quote unquote Seattle process and just kind of address the issues. It seems like that might be taking hold in some of the other cities along the West Coast. But from a political standpoint, I know Portland's had sort of a recent kind of not kind of come to Jesus moment, but things are sort of shifting radically around this pivot point you were talking about, Andrew, around the city leadership and choices they're making in addressing unsheltered people specifically in terms of the way the political attitudes and moods have changed in Portland.
Yeah, thank you on that. And again, I feel like this is a national conversation around a lot of urban centers, and I think it's acute on the West Coast. And I believe specifically because if you look at the last HUD point in time survey results, the 3 West Coast states plus Hawaii typically rank 1, 2, 3, or 4 in terms of their proportionate share of the unsheltered to their overall homeless population. And that usually holds true when you get down to the local, regional level. And so then you go to other places, for example, on the East Coast, where their proportionate share is vastly lower. I think it drives the decision-making and the voter sentiment. And I just dropped our polling into this, into the chat function for everybody to reveal, but it shows a remarkable change and shift in attitudes around what are the necessary policy solutions voters expect of their elected officials. And it all derives from 2 primary objectives that have been handed down from a federal and state lens. The first, that we are all under the auspice of the Martin v. Boise ruling from the 9th Circuit Court, which effectively indicates that cities, municipalities, localities can enforce sidewalk ordinances or ask people roughly to move or relocate should they not have enough shelter space or capacity to locate those individuals to. And then the state of Oregon similarly last session passed what we call an unfunded mandate, which directed local municipalities to come into compliance with the 9th Circuit Court ruling. So everything from a political standpoint, from a policy standpoint, is a derivative of those 2 conditions. And if you look into this polling that I just circulated, voters have now completely shifted away from saying that there's only 2 choices. We're either focused on the upstream solutions of housing, and we can't even talk about shelter. They've rejected that false choice. They have said, we want both. And in fact, I think Marisa said it very clearly. We want it all. We want rapid increase in housing production, one issue, and separately, we want rapid increase in sheltering capacity with the objective of ending unsheltered homelessness as far as that can be ended and ending unsanctioned camping within our regions. That is, from 2 years ago to today, a rapid departure from where we used to be accustomed to in our region of talking about this false choice of either housing or shelter. It's both, and we recognize it as a continuum. So this is a wholesale departure. And it also then comes concurrently with a massive analysis of the rising cost of living, which we've sort of self-inflicted upon ourselves through this, again, underproduction of housing and in fact, tax increases overall. So the voter sentiment has changed so dramatically and so clearly, and we're seeing a rapid adaptation by our elected officials. In fact, I'm going to say that our mayor had perhaps some San Francisco envy, because when Mayor Breed came out with the emergency orders concerning the Tenderloin district, you'll notice that literally this month, our mayor similarly came out with a set of emergency orders, not carbon copy, but working towards a similar state of urgency of getting people off streets, into treatment, into shelter capacity. So you're looking at a West Coast wide change in attitude from, in fact, some cases, the exact same leadership. This is our mayor. Our mayor's been in office for 6 years now. And so you're seeing this total radical departure from the status quo. And I would add in urgency and action, which we have never seen before. And I think it's driven by the way the community analyzes it and is talking to their elected officials, asking for radical change. So that's where we are in Portland.
And Marisa, in terms of San Francisco, around either unsheltered people or public safety, for instance, this notion of having it all in the the beautiful city by the bay, what does that translate to in just the day-to-day or the recent past in terms of what's changing, if it's changing the way it has changed in Portland?
Yeah, I mean, I think in order to answer this question, we have to be realistic and honest about how long the journey has been to get here. This is a series of policy choices and decisions and feelings and sentiments that have sort of led us on this path. And really, what I think most San Franciscans really felt was from a place of compassion. And then, back to the conversation we're having with Andrew, this idea of, wait, I want to continue to be compassionate. I want to continue to address these issues in a way that's helpful to all of us here in San Francisco. But at the same time, I want to feel safe going, taking my children to school. I want to feel safe when my children are playing at a playground and not to be worried that they're going to be pricked with needles or something along those lines, or just something unsafe. Or again, you're on your way to work and your garage door has been, broken into and your bike's stolen and things like that. The vantage point, the perspective that I think our city is sort of looking at this right now as we ring the alarm bells is one of public safety. I think, we had a problem, and especially in areas where there are encampments, of open air drug use. And I see a question in the chat about whether we think there is a correlation between an increase in crime and encampments. And, I don't want to criminalize homelessness, and that's not what I think anyone here wants to do or is talking about. But what we do see are, perhaps individuals preying on vulnerable populations, using those spaces to sort of mask their behavior. And I think we're at a point now where we'll say, look, you can't just be out here violating our laws, right? There has to be some sort of accountability. And we want to offer you an opportunity to address whatever challenges you're facing. Here are those options, but you can't be here doing that out in the open air drug sales, and even open air consumption. We want to provide treatment. We're a city rich in services. And the challenge then is also, how do you compel people to take you up on those services? And I think probably everyone on this call has had that challenge. We are more than willing to offer that, but there comes a point when you have to say, okay, well, what is the solution and what is working and what isn't? And as we're also having the same conversation around, social justice in this country and whether defunding the police is the right approach, and yet we're still facing these challenges, and time again, we don't seem to have a solution that isn't law enforcement based. And why is that? When we get to our wits' ends, who do we look to? We look to law enforcement. But time and time again, we realize, well, wait a minute. Police department isn't a health department. police department isn't, you know, necessarily the right avenue to address these issues. But we don't have anything, at least not currently. And perhaps others on this call can speak to maybe a different solution that's working. I'd love to hear it. But we time and time again rely. And right now, we're in a situation where our police department, you know, is seeing the lowest numbers of just staffing. This is an issue across the country for a variety of reasons. How do we address these issues? And how do they not become greater? How do we not end up in a greater crisis for all of us? And so it's a lot of challenge. There's, to Andrew's point as well, the future does feel a little uncertain. But I am actually very happy that we're talking about this desire to get to a place where it works for everyone. All communities want to feel safe. All communities don't want to feel like they're being over policed, but all communities want to have access to services, right?
Yeah, there's something to me that's sort of disheartening about that fact. It takes getting the really lousy poll numbers or the really clear poll numbers for the elected leaders to do something rather than sort of see what's coming down the line and lead in advance rather than reactively, I guess. But I guess we'll take what we can get, and that's one of the silver linings. We've been pushed far enough where the solutions are, if not clear, at least clearer than they were. In Los Angeles, let's talk about law enforcement a little bit. Is there some of the same issues that we're facing here in Seattle and Portland, San Francisco, in terms of staffing?
Yes, absolutely. When I heard Andrew and Marisa talk, I wanted to say same. And I mean, particularly, when Andrew was talking about the perception about temporary versus permanent housing over the last 2 years. Our poll numbers show exactly the same thing. 2 years ago, 50-50 split on people wanting temporary versus permanent housing. Now the scales are very much tipped on short-term housing. Also, the other thing that Andrew mentioned about people are impatient now. There's a sense of urgency. And Marisa, used the word empathy. The voters are empathetic. It's not that they're not empathetic, but they are impatient with the region's leadership, and they are ready for a change now. And as far as police, so we defunded the police here in 2020. We cut our budget by $150 million. And so what we are seeing now is that defunding the police resulted in reducing public safety. I mean, it's period. Our police chief has said the same. More police on the street equals higher public safety. It's a very simple, equation. So there's an advocacy effort right now to include some of those funds back in the budget. But what's interesting is even though, our staffing is much lower than we had before, we are actually understaffed for what our budget allows. So we are just having trouble even
here as well. And of course, COVID played a huge role in that too. I mean, issues around vaccines and losing police officers to things like that as well. But I think all of us are experiencing the same drop in police.
And cuts in funding to police is one radical reshifting of the model of the traditional model of how things are enforced or how things are managed. The other models are regional homeless authorities or entities that have cross boundaries, their jurisdiction crosses boundaries. Mm-hmm. Do you think the voters in your cities, whoever wants to jump in on this can take this one. Do you think that 8% number of on the right track in the Portland area, do the voters still believe that the traditional sort of city, county, state structure can actually solve these problems? Or is the cynicism past the point where they need something totally different? I mean, because as you say, you have the same mayor the last 6 years. We have a relatively new mayor here in Seattle. Mm-hmm. Got a mayor's election in Los Angeles. Mayor in San Francisco has been there for a little while. Is the old model still applicable, I guess?
Great question. I want to say too that similarly, our police budget was reduced dramatically in 2020. The city council already took action to restore much of that funding and do some stopgap measures to make sure that we can retain officers. What I think is even more interesting, especially for our connective tissue here of downtown associations, we have seen a massive increase in private security serving business and residential neighborhoods. Of course, because in the absence of a public safety entity, people will inevitably turn to whatever is the next most viable option. Whether you like it or don't like it, private security of public spaces is something that has exploded as a result of the reduction of, law enforcement writ large, whether it be police, sheriffs, but then also this approaches across different public safety entities, such as our district attorney's offices, our probation officers. You've seen almost a hollowing out in a vastly understaffed public safety apparatus. And I say that overall, and no matter what your perspective is on policing, everybody is clear they want an accountable police force and accountable public safety. So then to pivot into your question around new modeling of homeless services, one thing that was stood up really rapidly here in this organization, in this region, was a different approach to people going through mental health and chemical addiction crisis, right? Instead of police being responsive, trained mental health professionals are dispatched from our emergency responders, our first responders. It's known as Portland Street Response. We were a proud endorser and kind of co-authored the standing up of this, because we know that the police, frankly, and anybody in public safety do not want to, nor feel equipped to be able to intervene in these instances where people might be just going through some meth psychosis or mental health breakdown, which even the most proficiently trained mental health chemical addiction providers are just barely equipped to deal with this new type of street experience. So I'm very hopeful for that. And that's rolling out citywide right now here in the Portland region. So yes, new modalities. And then secondly, I would say we stood up the largest, it was a tri-county voter approved homeless services measure. We are now have the highest funding for homeless services in the nation per capita. And so voters have clearly said we're willing to invest our resources in services and interventions that we know work, as well as treat new modalities of dealing with the mental health crisis that don't involve the police. And in fact, the police are all on board with this because they do not want to be dealing with these conditions, which they are ill-equipped to be able to deal with. So I think we're working through these solutions and becoming more sophisticated as regions as we learn to experience this. And I'll say this, the Joint Office of Homeless Services, which is our sort of flagship entity, which deals with homelessness in the region, is only 7 years old. This is something that has just caught so many government entities off guard. And so in some ways, we're catching up and getting more sophisticated in developing the systems, the bureaucracies, and the technocrats necessary to be able to do this work, because we are vastly behind our peers on the other side of the country right now in terms of the services needed to intervene and to provide overall public safety to our communities.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about return to office. Suzanne, you said it's something like 15% is most recent numbers in the Los Angeles area. Yeah. And you, of course, you mentioned you have residents that help keep things going. What's that? Because that's 15%. That's a pretty low number. What do you guys have planned for the near term, medium term to get people back in their offices?
Well, and that's why we did the survey, understanding that there were not a lot of folks here. We wanted to see what the outlook was for the employees. And it really depends on what happens with the virus. Everyone had a January return to work date. I as late as December, I was advocating for additional safety resources, anticipating 200,000 people were going to return in January, and that changed in a matter of weeks. So what we're seeing is employers really are not setting a hard and fast date like they did previously. I think it's going to happen more organically, but from our poll numbers, it looks like people want to be back. And what's interesting, and we have been tracking visitation over throughout the pandemic, and we've seen while the number of individual people hasn't increased, the frequency with which they come back to the office has. So once someone starts coming back, they'll come back 1 day, then 2 days, then 3 days. So we anticipate as more of the population comes back, they will start with a few days, and that will increase as they return.
And so, Marisa, in San Francisco, have you had major employers signaling what they're going to do, or is it is it still too early to tell, or what's going on in the Bay Area?
Yeah, it's still been pretty fluid. There's a lot of talk. I mean, we're certainly talking with our city leaders about messaging and how to really put a little pressure on our businesses to return. I think we're just now emerging from this last variant. You know, the mask mandate is down. Everyone is still wearing masks. You know, so it's just kind of taking some time as people get more comfortable. And you know, there's still talk of, you know, you hear the chatter, is another variant coming? Are we out of the woods? So I think people are just taking it easy and slowly emerging, but there is talk about real campaigns to bring people back to work and back downtown.
And what about in Portland?
So we have a date certain of March 31st statewide to ending our mask mandate. And I think almost every single employer in the greater downtown region, but also I think statewide, is eyeing up that point in time to adjust to a new return to work paradigm. And I think obviously, just like everybody else, and I'm sure everyone who here is an employer, we're an employer similarly, building in a hybrid flexible model is something that is absolutely necessary. And it's something that I think all of us want to take away from the pandemic, is the ability to do both. Then simultaneously, how do we equip ourselves and deal with maybe the right sizing of office utilization? And I would say I'm really proud of the work we've done with the Greater Seattle Chamber of Commerce and a lot of the downtown associations on a Senate bill that's been working through specifically called the Downtown Revitalization Act. This is a federal bill, federal legislation that allows the use of tax credits similar to historic tax credits to repurpose commercial buildings into residential, because a shift of that magnitude and investment requires substantial support. And so I think this is going to be a long-term recalibration about utilization, but from an office return to work, we're looking and eyeing up April timeline for an overall return, and syncing up with the improvements in the weather. We want to get events back into our downtown core, and we've been focused on returning some of those old-fashioned things that we took for granted before the pandemic, like parades and events and concerts and music that used to occupy our public spaces, and making sure those have some rocket fuel in them for a successful overall return, not just to office work, but also to visitors and tourists alike.
And I would add to that, if I may,
yes.
Saturday, we'll have the Chinese New Year parade coming down. And that didn't get canceled. And of course, there was talk, oh, is it happening? Is it happening? It's happening. So really trying to push on that. And to your point, Andrew, I think in order to be competitive, there has to be this sort of hybrid. You can't, for employers, I mean, this is what the mass or what are you saying, the giant migration or resignation. People are looking for jobs, and they're looking for different opportunities that are flexible, and how do we compete with that, right? But still trying to urge people to come downtown. Interestingly, though, there are a lot of leases being signed for office space. And so it's very weird. And of course, property value is still going up. So how we do this, and I'm actually really curious to hear from you, Andrew, how these the projects to transform office space to housing, how that's panning out, because we're having a hard time making that make sense.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say this is part of a toolkit, right? It is certainly not the sole solution space, but I would say there's zero examples of this, and the legislation has not advanced yet. But I do think there is that evaluation that mixed use, as well as making sure we have residential mixed in, sort of similar to how LA, I just love that evaluation of how many people live in downtown LA. We've been new to that game in terms of adding residential population to our downtown core, but we're seeing a lot more multifamily being built in our center city. So it's not active right now. I would say it's just part of that continuum. And it's one of those things that we all know that we walk away from this pandemic and we look back on this really ridiculous time frame in our country's history and our world's history, that repositioning commercial buildings is going to be something that has to happen. And so we got to think long game on this one. So I can't say there's any direct examples of it, but it's just part of being an advocate for the solutions that we know we are all going to need.
Yeah, we did an analysis too of, the proposal in California for that kind of conversion, and it's very exciting. But crunching the numbers, it really would not generate a huge amount of residential units when you're looking at all the potential properties that this could happen in. But I agree with Andrew, and I think I've used the same phrase. It's a tool in the toolkit, and it would be a great one to have.
One thing I think a lot of us have learned in the pandemic is that predicting is kind of a waste of time, because you can barely even, hard to predict a week or two out ahead sometimes, the way things were happening so fast a year and a half ago, or when a new variant emerged right after Thanksgiving. But a bigger picture, is it, obviously the workplace is very different now, the work from home, the hybrid work, the people moving, back to Ohio, to be with family while they're still working in San Francisco or Portland or Seattle or LA. Do you, within your organizations, is there sort of collective worrying late at night about the whole, like what a downtown will look like 6 months from now, or a year from now? What long lasting impacts on the more challenging column might still be there, and how those should or can be addressed even? Who wants to take that first? Maybe you, Suzanne.
Yeah, I can start. No, I'm really optimistic. Maybe I'm not. So I am not worried, long term, because I see the continued investment in downtown. There was just a report by CBRE that they came out last night, or recently, and there's a record amount of investment in the United States, and Los Angeles the greater Los Angeles area accounted for almost 10% of the investment in the entire nation in commercial real estate. And commercial real estate owners are in this for the long term. So I take that as a very good indicator about the prospects for downtown Los Angeles. And I'm optimistic that as this mask mandate comes down, and I've seen it, our mask mandate went away in June of last year. It was an almost immediate change in the landscape downtown. And when that comes for us, in a month or so, even though the mask mandate came down for the state of California, Los Angeles was one of 2 counties that decided to keep it in place. But once that comes down, probably by the end of March, I expect to see an increase in activity pretty shortly thereafter.
Marisa, how about you?
Yeah, no, thank you. I also want to feel very optimistic about this. There are indicators that we're seeing investment in even in retail, right? Which is really kind of remarkable given some of the latest events and issues. But I will say you can't pass go without communities feeling safe and secure. And I think that perception has to shift, right? Especially for highly touristic communities, tourism hubs, that has to be addressed. And there's some questions or just comments in the chat that I kind of want to go back to with when you kind of think about safety and the importance of kind of how we're looking at this collectively and what our goal is long term and vision is for public safety. And I think, again, we can't move forward without conversations around bias training and support. And, we want to bring sort of a younger generation into the fold around the future of policing in America, right? And what that looks like so that we can have a healthy police department. I think it's no secret that, you mentioned I just started in this role in October. I have a law enforcement background. Are there a lot of, heads of CBDs and BIDs that were former prosecutors? I think it's not a secret that it's because there's an issue here and people want to address what is really the biggest issue. We can't have thriving communities until we address safety. And when we do that, then we can start to bring back tourism, we can start to bring back conventions, we start to bring back people to work. People are afraid to ride public transportation. On and on, both for COVID and for public safety issues. Our small business community can't thrive when it's not safe either. So, but really important to have this conversation around where we went wrong when it comes to law enforcement in this country, and why that reform still needs to move forward. But we need to be thoughtful about how we do this. We need to think about our approaches. Training is so key. We don't want to set people up for failure. We certainly don't want there to be chilling effect. We want people to thrive in their work. And then to my colleagues on this call, Suzanne and Andrew's points about the importance of, all of this working together. We can have both, right? We can have both, but it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot of leaning on our politicians, as you just mentioned, Felix. You were asking, are we just going to take a completely different approach? Can we rely on our government to make these choices? What we can rely on, I think, wholeheartedly, is our actual voices, because I don't think they're loud enough. And our politicians certainly take to what's the loudest in the room, right? So
let's talk about that issue, a character identity issue, for a second. We broached on a little bit earlier. The West Coast, the urban areas on the West Coast are comparatively young compared with, urban areas on the East Coast or the central part of the United States. Seattle is roughly 160 years old, something like that. I think Portland's slightly older than that. San Francisco, certainly similar age, and LA probably a little bit fresher than that even. And the West Coast is special because it's sunny, the sun sets out here, it's progressive, it's hip, it's all the things that we think about when we live in a place like Seattle or San Francisco or Portland or LA. We're here for a reason. With these changes we're talking about, these pivot points, whether it's around law enforcement or around encampments or anything like that impacts life in a downtown like the ones that were represented here today. How do you address those things without longer term changing, shifting, radically altering the character and the identity of these cities that have been almost kind of open and welcoming and almost, progressive and liberal? Are those things in danger of going away? If those things change, is that a bad thing? I mean, what's the character and identity issues? Who wants to take a whack at that first?
I want to dive in because, I am similarly optimistic. First, let us not ignore the fact that this pandemic has deprived us all of human connection. This is not normal what we're doing right now, right? Wearing a mask and standing 6 feet apart. I tell my children, I can't remember how many times I've told I have 3 children under 5. Oh, you have to give some distance. Doesn't work. That's not human nature. We did it because we had to. And the West Coast should be commended for how many lives it saved, for the public health response. We prioritize that, but it has had its consequences. We cannot ignore that. The thing that I also am so excited about, I think it's the maturation of these regions. For the first time ever, and part of this conversation, if you look into our analysis, State of the Economy report, Portland is no longer the whitest city in the nation. And we joined the Union during the Civil War as committed to being a free state, but to the exclusion of Black people. So you see this literal DNA of the state completely conflicted from its value proposition to its actions. That is going to change as our regions, and this is true, by the way, if you look, we pointed out Seattle similar, rapidly diversifying as we compare ourselves to other regions. That is a good thing. It represents not just diversity of race, but also of thought, of idea. And then at the same time, the enormous financial, economic inequities built into that diversification are also present in that same report. And it shows that disparity. They got worse with the pandemic. So in some ways, we have got to come out of this experience and take a different path, and it's probably a good thing that we aren't going to be the same as we used to be, because what we used to be wasn't exactly a great thing. And we always patted ourselves on the back because, yes, people have been coming here for centuries because of the promise of a good quality of life. Here I am sitting on the side of Mount Hood. I was in downtown Portland this morning. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It is amazing. But we got to be different coming out of this, and particularly for communities of color. And I think this is the opportunity and the promise of these cities and these urban centers here on the West Coast, is we can be different because we can write a different script because we are newer. So I am optimistic, and boy, the end of this pandemic can't come soon enough, because I think we have not grappled with the reality of the consequences of this on all of us, on our mental health and the directions of our economies.
Yeah, I think good and bad. I think there'll be things that will emerge. It'll be like, wow, look what we do now because of the pandemic, or look what's different now because of that. But yeah, I think long term it's gonna unfold slowly. I share your optimism too. I think that's part of the West Coast also, the sense of rebirth, of a new beginning. My parents immigrated from Europe after World War II, and Seattle's a paradise. In terms of where they'd lived previously, and I still think that's true. But yeah, there's inequities that are baked in that if this is our opportunity to address those, my hope is that there's leadership that emerges to shape that conversation. So it's not just the default. I mean, it's always been the default, whatever was the cheapest or whatever was the most expedient. It doesn't seem like you can do that anymore and still expect to be sustainable and be the great cities that we've been, that we want to continue being. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. Marisa, what about you? Talk to me about this notion of the identity and struggling with issues of character and identity around these shifts in values.
Yeah, I think the culture, the spirit, it's here. There's been some changes, I think, in the last 25 years that, are different. I mean, people are different, quality of life are all different, but I think, San Francisco has been dealing with pricing a lot of communities out, making it very difficult to really just live and exist here because it is so expensive. And so I don't know that I see that changing. I mean, even during a global pandemic, cost of living pretty much stayed and actually went up as people moved out of apartments and looked for single family homes to give a yard for their kids to, ride out this pandemic. But I think all in all, this has been really good for San Franciscans to have to face some of these challenges head on, participate in the conversation, say what it is that we really truly want, and really talk about how we can get to a place where we can have both. But understand we can't do these things in a silo. You can have some really well-intentioned people and want to get behind them, but in the end, if all of your systems that you have in place can't support these ideals, it breaks down, and that's challenging. And I think we want to stay focused on creating a healthy world for everyone, but understand that we have to do it in steps, and we have to continue to be thoughtful about these things. But these are tough. These are really tough issues. I think it's false to think that other communities are kind of handling this better. The issue is being attracted to the West Coast. We want to have to kind of put that out there. We're seeing a lot of challenges on our street that didn't necessarily come just from our streets. They come from other communities. They come from other states even. And that's been an issue for a long time. So we are here now trying to deal with what is really a federal issue. If you ask me, I think we need a lot more support to be able to get ourselves out from under this. This isn't just we woke up and all of a sudden everybody in San Francisco was homeless or dealing with mental health crisis or dealing with an opiate epidemic and on and on and on. This is something our entire country is dealing with here in San Francisco, and will continue to be that. And yes, compassion fatigue is a real thing. And I saw that in the comments as well.
Yeah.
But we want to continue to be that beacon of light, but we can't do it alone. And LA can't do it alone. California can't do it. The West Coast can't do it alone. Portland can't do it alone. We need support here. And that's a real thing.
Part of it, I mean, there's one of those comments, part of it resonates for me is just someone said, I want to feel safe and also pride. I love Seattle. Too much rhetoric today. I want to know if there is a plan, how we can all help. I want to feel safe again. That's something that's bothered me for a long time, is this notion of elected leaders sort of telling what the issue is, how we're going to address it, but then how I can be part of the solution rather than just sit on the sidelines. And I think we're seeing politics shifting to more specific approaches, actually specific plans about what's going to happen versus the rhetoric about I'll be tough on this or I'll be tough on that or I'll be more compassionate about this and that. I think that kind of granular detail, that stuff gets blotted out of the way in the age of social media when it's all about the soundbite and the really short little hit, and you don't have the time to really go into the really sort of the mundane aspects of policy and of actually running a city and a county and all that stuff. It's not sexy necessarily. It's just it's a lot of detail that it's hard to get through in these short times we have together. But we have just a couple minutes left. I want to ask you guys, I know we've talked about a lot of good stuff, a lot of bad stuff, but you all strike me as optimistic people. And I think everyone who works in this field, and especially in the cities that we all live in, it gives you a certain sense of optimism in spite of the challenges, or maybe because of the challenges. So let's start with you, Suzanne. Tell me one thing that you're optimistic about, that you're really excited about in the coming 6 months, and or a silver lining that you didn't anticipate from the pandemic moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, with an increase in the visibility of homeless became an increase of the awareness of the impacts of homelessness. So I think voters became a lot more engaged. And, for the people who are listening, and what can you do? Talk to your legislators, because I have seen that have real results. Just an example of something that happened. Our supervisors were able to develop a project, 232 units, took 5 months from start to finish at $200,000 a unit. That timeline, usually it takes 3 years and it's $500,000 to $600,000. But they did this over the pandemic with CARES Fund. And they did this because they heard from the voters that there's a sense of urgency. And it's a beautiful facility. I am very encouraged by that example, and that they did it and it's successful, and that we're going to be able to see more of that happening. And I think I'll end with that. I know we're getting close out of time.
And Andrew, I'm going to give you 20 seconds to do the same for Portland.
Yeah, I am really excited. Most specifically, I'm going to highlight for everybody, because you should all be here for it. The state of Oregon and Portland will be hosting the World Track and Field Games of 2022. These will be the largest spectator sport experiences in the world this year, because as everyone knows, the Beijing Olympics is not permitting in-person attendees. In July, we'll be hosting the world's athletes and the world's media right here. And I think this is one of those galvanizing moments for our region and our state to focus on and spread the message that we're open for business, that there's an exciting and opportunity to come spend time here and experience all the great things that Portland and Oregon have to offer. And we know this will have derivative benefits for our entire West Coast, and also our brand, reputation, and all the good things that make Portland great. So hugely excited about that. And I'm a big fan of track and field events. So double down on that.
Very nice. And Marisa, what about you?
Yeah, just to say that I'm actually excited that all eyes and all focus from our city are on the issues that we've been talking about for some time. And it feels like there is that real sense of urgency, and that it's real and that it's committed. We heard a lot, in December and November, especially around the mass lootings and people being, that just kind of tipped it over. But the response from our community and from our city has been incredible. And we are feeling the difference, and we are seeing the difference. And in fact, believe it or not, in December, burglary was down 100% in Stanford, in the area, in Union Square, in the area that I'm in. And that was huge. I've never seen a stat like that, because attention was focused. And I think that says a lot. And I'm looking forward to all the activities, like everyone here, that we have planned for the summer, and certainly going into the holiday season. This is going to be one that I think everyone's excited to blow out, because we're hoping we can all come back together and do the things that we're all nostalgic about. And Union Square is definitely that place where people come for the holidays and enjoy it with their family, and they can, because we've created a safer environment for all to enjoy, and really all San Franciscans to enjoy, and Bay Area residents and everyone else who's watching today. So
thank you, Marisa Rodriguez, Suzanne Holley, and Andrew Hoan. And thank you all for joining us for today's session of DSA Virtual Access. Thanks to the DSA staff. Coming up next month, DSA will present the annual State of Downtown. Registration is still open for that event, which will take place on Thursday, March 17th. Our next DSA Virtual Access event in this series will be held on Thursday, April 21st. Until then, I'm Felix Bonnell for the Downtown Seattle Association, and we will see you downtown.